Okay, so Unit 2 is all about biodiversity, and so that's what we're going to be talking about. So with Module 1, well, let's kind of run through the different modules. So we're going to start off with biodiversity, move into ecosystem services, then we're going to talk about a concept called island biogeography. We'll then talk about ecosystem tolerance, disruptions to ecosystems, adaptations that organisms make in response to disturbances or changes in the ecosystem, and then lastly, ecological succession. What happens after a disturbance to an ecosystem as it recovers? Okay, so we're going to start with we'll talk kind of about this benefits of biodiversity, which is the case study at the beginning of the unit. I really like these case studies because they introduce you to the concepts that you're going to be learning about through this unit. So the key point here is that rich food webs have higher productivity and are more stable when changes or disturbances occur within the ecosystem. And so having those rich food webs allows for like a diversity of plants, which we can see in this picture here. And when there's this large biodiversity, we actually have a much more productive ecosystem, which is able to sustain more complex food webs. So, and this way, if something happens like a flood or a grassland fire moves in or something like that, this ecosystem would be able to recover quickly, generally, when it's a really diverse ecosystem like this. Okay, all right, so that's kind of a main point that you'll be hearing about throughout the unit. All right, so Module 8 is going to be which is 2.1, is our introduction to biodiversity. And so essentially there's different levels of biodiversity: ecosystem, habitat, oops, that's spelled wrong, species diversity, and then genetic diversity. Let me fix this really quickly. This should not say habitat. It should say habitat. There we go. And so you need to understand those 4 levels of biodiversity. I really like this graphic because it shows you, it starts here with the individual, moves here where we're moving into, let me turn my phone off since it's ringing at this point. But then we move into like a small area, having lots of species, and then moving into this larger habitat, and then moving into ecosystems. Okay, so I really do like that image. And so you need to know what each of these different levels are, and you should be able to identify each of those and give a brief description of each of those. Okay, again, don't forget to be looking at all these vocab words that you see. And I also like the images because they give you lots of examples of the content. So make sure, just as a reminder, that you're looking through images, taking your notes, and then also looking at these vocab words, which are key. Another thing that I found useful throughout the unit are these, or throughout the book, the textbook, are these AP exam tips. And so here it says you're required to show all work for math problems on the AP Environmental Science test. You have to show each step of the math, and it does say remember to include units. However, this is now old. They stated last year that you do not have to show the units. I'm going to make it a habit with you all that you show your work and show the units throughout, just so that I know that you're doing things correctly. But then when it comes time for, that's when we're practicing, but when it comes time for a test, I'm gonna ask that you don't use units, because if you have the wrong units accidentally, you can miss the question. But if you don't have any units at all and just have the right correct numbers, you'll actually get credit. So we'll talk about that more as we go, but that's a good exam tip. Okay, then this moves on and talks about how increasing biodiversity actually improves your populations and ecosystems, and it impacts in a positive way how they respond to stressors. And so one example that they do talk about is having like the consequences of genetic diversity when there's not a lot of genetic diversity. what happens? Well, a famous example is the bottlenecks, a bottleneck within the cheetah population. And this happened about 10,000 years ago. And now all cheetahs have a gene which makes them very susceptible to a fatal pathogen. And so they talk about that more and describe that more in the reading. So make sure that you understand that and that you also understand what a bottleneck is. We're going to be talking about a bottleneck a little bit later, but for this unit test, you will have to understand that. Okay, some other key points that I noticed throughout this section of reading is that specialists and specialist species, those that are adapted to a small niche, and also large migrating communities are impacted most by lower habitat diversity. Okay, and so think of things when we think of migrating communities, think of like bison, think of gazelles, think of birds. All of those different types of organisms are things that would be considered a large migrating community. All right, and so that's the consequences of habitat diversity, is that these organisms are most impacted when there's low diversity, and then there's some sort of a stressor, and then it impacts these folks here. All right, some keys to species diversity. First of all, having high species diversity leads to higher productivity, which we talked about in this picture back here with this wetland ecosystem. It also has, if you have high species diversity, you end up having usually high resilience to any sort of stressor. So what that means is that high resilience, we get high recovery after a disturbance and high resistance from the ecosystem changing because of a disturbance. Another key point that was made throughout this section was that species diversity is a critical environmental indicator. So if we have low species diversity, that usually tells us that there's something wrong with the ecosystem. Whether it's a human disturbance or a natural disturbance, something's wrong. A key example of that are frogs. The frog populations are declining across the world, and we think it has to do a lot with the amount of toxins that humans are putting into the environment. Amphibians are organisms that literally breathe through their skin, and they take in, everything just passes through their skin. That's how they're able to survive, essentially. And so we're finding that these are an indicator species of something wrong in the environment. And scientists are studying this a lot. This has been studied for years. I can remember being in college and learning that frogs were an indicator species. So anyway, that is something that I wanted to point out in the unit as well. And then another key point here is that we can actually quantify biodiversity if we measure the amount of species richness and species evenness. This picture is a classical APES question. I've seen this question in many forms. It was an FRQ several years ago. It's a question on the test. You almost always see them comparing two forests, one having high species. Well, you have to decide. Like, you look at community one, does it have high evenness? Does it have high richness? All right, and then compare that to community two. Does it have, tell me about its species richness and species evenness, and then make a determination about which one is a more biodiverse community. In this situation, community one would be more biodiverse. So if you have any questions about that after you've done the reading, make sure that you talk to me. Okay, let's see. Yes, make sure you know richness versus evenness. Know this image. It's on a lot of tests. A key tip here that I was just reading is that if you cannot remember a vocab term, you can completely describe that term and still get credit. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. That's another good AP tip. I have students a lot of times forget the words evenness and richness, but they can describe the concept, and so then they can still get their credit on the test. Okay, that's it for Module 8. Next time we'll be back with Module 9, and we'll be talking about the services that ecosystems provide to humans.